It all started on an ordinary Tuesday morning when Ruth noticed a small red spot on her cheek. At first, she thought it was just a pimple, something trivial that would go away in a few days. She didn't pay much attention to it as she hurried to get ready for school. The day was like any other. Classes dragged on, friends chatted in the hallways, and Ruth did her best to blend in. But as the days passed, the red spot didn't go away. Instead, it grew larger and more painful. Ruth found herself constantly touching it, feeling the strange, throbbing sensation under her skin. Her mother dismissed it as just a bad pimple, advising Ruth to leave it alone. But it wasn't that easy. The spot seemed to have a life of its own, pulsating and growing. One night, Ruth stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at the red spot. It had grown to the size of a marble and was now a dark, angry red. She could feel the heat radiating from it, and the pain was becoming unbearable. Ruth's friends started noticing too, whispering behind her back and giving her concerned looks. She felt embarrassed, constantly trying to cover it with her hair or makeup, but nothing seemed to help. The following week, Ruth woke up to find the red spot had swollen even more. It was now impossible to hide, and she couldn't ignore the sharp, stabbing pain that accompanied it. She decided to skip school and visit the doctor. The doctor examined it, frowning in confusion. He prescribed some ointment, telling her it was likely an infected cyst and that it would go away with proper care. Ruth followed the doctor's advice, applying the ointment religiously, but the spot continued to grow. By the end of the week, it was the size of a golf ball, and Ruth could feel something moving inside it. The sensation was sickening, and she was terrified of what it could mean. She tried to tell her mother again, but was met with the same dismissive attitude. One evening, Ruth was sitting in her room, staring at the swollen, throbbing spot in the mirror. She could see something moving under her skin, a shadowy, writhing mass. Panic set in, and she felt a wave of nausea. She knew something was terribly wrong. She grabbed a needle from her sewing kit, her hands shaking, and decided she couldn't wait any longer. As she brought the needle closer to her skin, she hesitated, fear gripping her. But the pain and the sensation of movement were too much to bear. She closed her eyes and pricked the center of the red spot. Instantly, a tiny hole appeared, and a dark, thick liquid began to ooze out. Ruth's eyes widened in horror as she saw tiny legs protruding from the hole. She screamed, dropping the needle, and stumbled back from the mirror. In a matter of seconds, the red spot burst open, and hundreds of baby spiders spilled out, crawling across her face and down her neck. Ruth screamed again, swatting at them frantically, her mind unable to process the nightmare unfolding before her. She could feel them in her hair, on her skin, and the room seemed to spin around her. Her mother rushed in, alarmed by the screaming, and froze in shock at the sight. The bathroom was filled with the tiny, crawling horrors, and Ruth was sobbing uncontrollably, her face a mix of blood, pus, and spider legs. The nightmarish reality of what had been living inside her skin was too much to bear. The days following the horrific incident were a blur for Ruth. Her mother had rushed her to the hospital, where doctors cleaned the wound and prescribed antibiotics to prevent any infections. But the psychological damage was far greater than the physical. Ruth could still feel the ghostly sensation of tiny legs crawling on her skin, an unshakable feeling of dread that haunted her every waking moment. At school, the story of Ruth's ordeal spread like wildfire. Whispers followed her everywhere, and her classmates avoided her like she was contagious. She felt like an outcast, isolated and terrified. The teachers tried to intervene, but the damage was done. Ruth's once normal life had been turned upside down by a nightmare she couldn't escape. Ruth's mother, feeling guilty for not taking her complaints seriously, tried to comfort her. She arranged for Ruth to see a therapist, hoping professional help might ease her daughter's trauma. Ruth reluctantly attended the sessions but found it hard to open up about what had happened. The memory was too fresh, too raw, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw the swarm of spiders again. The therapist, Dr. Keller, was patient and understanding. She encouraged Ruth to talk about her fears and nightmares, to confront the trauma head-on. Slowly, Ruth began to share bits and pieces of her experience, each session peeling back another layer of her terror. Dr. Keller suggested that they focus on understanding the root of her fear, the underlying anxiety that the spiders had triggered. Despite the therapy, Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The area where the red spot had been continued to itch and throb, as if a reminder of the horror that had been there. She found herself obsessively checking her skin, terrified of finding another spot, another infestation. Her grades started to slip, and she withdrew from her friends, unable to explain her constant anxiety. One night, Ruth was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The room was silent, except for the occasional creak of the house settling. She felt a sudden, sharp pain on her arm and bolted upright, turning on the lamp. There, on her forearm, was another red spot, small but unmistakable. Her heart raced, and she felt bile rise in her throat. Not again, she thought, not this nightmare again. She rushed to the bathroom, her hands shaking as she examined the new spot in the mirror. It looked exactly like the first one had, a small, angry red bump. Ruth's breath came in short gasps, and she felt a wave of dizziness. She knew she had to do something, but fear paralyzed her. She couldn't go through the same horror again. Desperate, she decided to confront the source of her fear. She grabbed the needle from her sewing kit and, with a deep breath, pricked the center of the red spot. This time, a single baby spider crawled out, followed by another and another. Ruth felt her mind teetering on the edge of sanity. She managed to trap a few of them in a glass jar, her hands trembling as she sealed the lid. The next day, Ruth brought the jar to Dr. Keller, hoping for some kind of explanation. The therapist was shocked but composed, promising to have the spiders analyzed by an expert. Ruth's anxiety only grew as she waited for answers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with her, something that went beyond the spiders. When Dr. Keller finally called with the results, Ruth felt a mix of relief and dread. The therapist explained that the spiders were a rare species, one that typically didn't infest humans. It was a mystery how they had ended up inside Ruth's skin, but the expert suggested that they might have been laid there by a larger spider while Ruth slept. Ruth's mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. She couldn't help but wonder if there was a bigger, more dangerous spider lurking somewhere in her house, waiting to lay its eggs again. The thought kept her awake at night, her eyes wide open in the darkness, listening for any sign of movement. Ruth's paranoia grew with each passing day. The discovery of the new red spot had sent her spiraling into a state of constant fear. She could barely concentrate in school, her eyes darting around the room, imagining spiders lurking in every shadow. Her friends tried to reach out to her, but Ruth pushed them away, too consumed by her anxiety to let anyone in. Her mother, desperate to help, began to take her fears more seriously. She hired an exterminator to inspect their home from top to bottom, hoping to find the source of the spiders. The exterminator, a grizzled man named Hank, assured them that he would leave no stone unturned. He searched every corner, every crevice, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No nests, no large spiders, nothing to explain Ruth's horrifying experience. Despite Hank's assurances, Ruth's fears only intensified. She became obsessed with cleanliness, scrubbing every surface of her room, washing her sheets daily, and even vacuuming her mattress. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was constantly under threat. At night, she would lie awake, her ears straining for the slightest sound, her skin crawling with phantom sensations. The nightmares continued, vivid and horrifying. Ruth dreamed of being covered in spiders, their tiny legs scurrying over her skin, invading her body. She would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother would rush in, trying to soothe her, but the comfort was always short-lived. The fear was too deep, too ingrained. One afternoon, Ruth noticed a peculiar behavior in her dog, Max. He was scratching furiously at his fur and whining in discomfort. She examined him closely and found several red spots on his belly, similar to the ones that had appeared on her skin. Panic surged through her. If the spiders were now targeting Max, then the problem was far from over. Ruth immediately took Max to the vet, explaining the situation as best she could without sounding completely insane. The vet, a kind woman named Dr. Evans, listened attentively and conducted a thorough examination. She took samples from the red spots and promised to have them analyzed. Ruth left the clinic feeling more anxious than ever. The results came back a few days later. Dr. Evans called Ruth and her mother in for a meeting. She explained that the samples contained the same rare species of spider that had infested Ruth. The vet was baffled, saying that this species was not native to the area and rarely interacted with humans or pets. She suggested that they bring in an entomologist to investigate further. Ruth's mother agreed, and soon an entomologist named Dr. Weaver was examining their home. Dr. Weaver was fascinated by the case, taking detailed notes and collecting samples. He spent hours talking to Ruth, trying to piece together the mystery. Ruth shared everything she could remember, from the first appearance of the red spot to the latest nightmare. As the investigation progressed, Dr. Weaver made a startling discovery. He found traces of a powerful pheromone in the samples taken from Ruth and Max. This pheromone, he explained, was used by certain species of spiders to attract mates and mark territory. Somehow, Ruth had been exposed to this pheromone, which was causing the spiders to be drawn to her. The revelation was both a relief and a new source of fear. Ruth finally had an explanation, but it didn't make her feel any safer. Dr. Weaver suggested a series of treatments to neutralize the pheromone and recommended that Ruth and her mother temporarily move out of the house while he conducted a more thorough investigation. Ruth was hesitant to leave her home, but the thought of another infestation was too much to bear. She and her mother packed their bags and moved into a hotel for a few weeks. The change of scenery helped, but Ruth's anxiety remained high. She couldn't shake the feeling that the spiders would find her no matter where she went. Dr. Weaver continued his work, and soon the house was declared free of spiders. Ruth and her mother returned home cautiously optimistic. But Ruth's paranoia was hard to quell. She still felt phantom sensations on her skin and couldn't shake the nightmares that plagued her sleep. One evening, while Ruth was sitting on her bed, she felt a familiar sharp pain on her neck. Her heart sank as she rushed to the mirror. There, in the exact same spot as before, was another red bump, already starting to swell. Ruth stared at the new red spot in the mirror, her hands trembling. The familiar fear surged through her, threatening to overwhelm her. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She rushed to her mother, showing her the new spot and begging for help. Her mother, already on edge from the previous incidents, immediately called Dr. Weaver. Dr. Weaver arrived within the hour, bringing a portable lab setup. He examined the new spot with a magnifying glass, his face grave. "This isn't normal," he muttered, more to himself than to Ruth or her mother. "We need to figure out what's causing this." He took a sample from the spot, using a tiny needle to extract some fluid. Ruth winced at the pain but held still, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. Dr. Weaver worked quickly, analyzing the sample under a microscope. What he found made his blood run cold. "This pheromone," he explained, "it's not just attracting spiders. It's altering their behavior, making them aggressive and reproductive in a way that's unnatural. Something, or someone, has engineered this." The implications of his words hung heavy in the room. Ruth's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "You mean, someone did this on purpose?" Dr. Weaver nodded, his expression dark. "It's possible. This isn't something that happens in nature. Someone has introduced this pheromone to Ruth and her environment. We need to find out who and why." Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. The idea that someone was targeting her, manipulating her life in such a grotesque way, was almost too much to comprehend. "But who would do this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "And why?" Dr. Weaver didn't have an answer, but he promised to find out. He suggested that they install surveillance cameras around the house and in Ruth's room, hoping to catch any suspicious activity. Ruth agreed, desperate for any solution that might end her nightmare. The next few days were tense. Ruth stayed home from school, too afraid to leave the house. The cameras were set up, and Dr. Weaver monitored the footage closely. Ruth couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, her paranoia growing with each passing hour. One night, Ruth was lying in bed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The new red spot had grown, and she could feel the familiar throbbing under her skin. Just as she was drifting off to sleep, she heard a faint clicking sound coming from her window. She froze, her heart pounding. The sound grew louder, and she realized it was the sound of something tapping against the glass. She got out of bed slowly, her hands shaking as she reached for the baseball bat she kept nearby. As she approached the window, the tapping stopped. Ruth held her breath, listening. She could hear a faint rustling sound outside, like something moving through the bushes. Gathering her courage, she pulled back the curtain and peered outside. In the dim light, she could make out a figure crouching near the side of the house. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, almost blending in with the shadows. Ruth's heart raced as she watched the person carefully place something against the wall before slinking away into the darkness. Ruth didn't hesitate. She ran to her mother's room and woke her up. Together, they reviewed the surveillance footage. The cameras had captured the intruder's actions, including the moment they placed a small, cylindrical device against the side of the house. Dr. Weaver arrived shortly after, examining the footage with a furrowed brow. "This device," he said, pointing to the screen. "It looks like a dispersal unit. It's likely the source of the pheromone." Ruth's mother called the police, providing them with the footage. The authorities promised to investigate, but Ruth couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Someone was targeting her, and the thought of it made her skin crawl. She was determined to find out who it was and put an end to the nightmare once and for all. That night, Ruth lay awake, clutching the baseball bat tightly. She knew she had to confront this head-on. The fear of the unknown had haunted her long enough, and it was time to take control. She just hoped she could muster the courage to face whatever, or whoever, was behind the horrific events that had plagued her life. The next morning, Ruth and her mother awoke to a sense of determination. The night had been long and sleepless, filled with whispers of fear and a shared resolve to end the nightmare that had taken over their lives. Dr. Weaver had stayed overnight, working tirelessly to analyze the pheromone dispersal device the intruder had left behind. Ruth sat at the kitchen table, watching as Dr. Weaver carefully dismantled the device. Her mother hovered nearby, her worry evident in the furrow of her brow. Ruth's mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of terror that had defined her recent days. She knew that the answer was close, that the key to ending this horror lay in understanding who had created the device and why. As Dr. Weaver finished his analysis, he looked up, his expression grave. "The device was custom-made," he said, "and it's designed to release the pheromone in precise amounts. Whoever did this knows what they're doing. They're using advanced techniques to manipulate the spider's behavior." Ruth's mother nodded, her face pale. But who would do this, and why target Ruth? Dr. Weaver hesitated, then spoke. "I've been in contact with a colleague who specializes in entomological warfare. It's a rare field, but it involves using insects as weapons. He mentioned that there have been a few cases like this, where people were targeted with pheromone-based attacks. It's usually done for revenge or to instill fear." Ruth felt a cold chill run down her spine. "Revenge? But I haven't done anything to anyone. Why would someone want to hurt me?" Dr. Weaver shook his head. "I don't know, Ruth, but we need to find out. We need to track down the person responsible and stop them before they can do any more harm." The police arrived shortly after, armed with the information Dr. Weaver had gathered. They assured Ruth and her mother that they would do everything in their power to find the perpetrator. In the meantime, Ruth was determined not to live in fear any longer. She decided to take matters into her own hands. That night, Ruth set up a trap. She placed a dummy device similar to the one the intruder had left, but this time with a hidden camera inside. She hoped that whoever was behind the attacks would return to check on their work. She stayed up, her nerves on edge, clutching the baseball bat as she waited in the darkness. Hours passed, and just as Ruth was about to give up, she heard the familiar tapping sound at her window. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crept towards the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. The same dark figure was there, moving cautiously, checking the dummy device. The hidden camera captured everything, and Ruth knew they finally had the evidence they needed. She dialed Dr. Weaver's number, whispering urgently into the phone. "They're here. The camera's working. We've got them." Dr. Weaver and the police arrived within minutes, surrounding the house. The figure tried to flee but was quickly apprehended. Ruth watched from the safety of her room as the police led the intruder away. The relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by a deep sense of violation. Someone had targeted her, had invaded her life in the most horrific way possible. The intruder was identified as a former colleague of Ruth's mother, someone she had had a falling out with years ago. The motive was revenge, a twisted desire to cause pain and fear. Ruth's mother was devastated, but grateful that her daughter was finally safe. Ruth continued to see Dr. Keller, working through the trauma of her ordeal. The nightmares persisted, but with time and support, she began to heal. The scars on her skin were a constant reminder of the horror she had endured, but they also symbolized her strength and resilience. Life slowly returned to normal, but Ruth was forever changed. She had faced a terror most people couldn't imagine, and she had survived. The fear of the red spots and the spiders would always linger in the back of her mind, but she had learned to confront her fears head-on. In the end, the ordeal had brought Ruth and her mother closer together. They leaned on each other, finding strength in their bond. Ruth knew that she could face anything with her mother's support, and the knowledge that she had the courage to overcome even the most unimaginable horrors.